The future, as we say, of British Steel hangs in the balance this morning after the government refused to confirm if those furnaces will keep burning. We're going to speak to steel worker Tom Smith in just a moment. But first, here's James Goodison to explain exactly how we've got to this point.
What is British Steel? Owned by Chinese company Jingye since 2019, British Steel's plant in Scunthorpe employs 2,700 people and is the last place in the UK that can make virgin steel. Why is it in trouble? The company said the plant was losing nearly £5 million a week and they were looking to close the furnaces. They blamed competitive markets, but Jingye not only didn't buy the materials they needed on time, but they also sold existing supplies. Why did the government act? British Steel's closure would mean the UK was the only G7 country that can't produce its own virgin steel, and not having our own supply could put defence and infrastructure projects at risk. The government responded to ensure the furnaces didn't cool, as it would be neither easy nor cost-effective to bring them back online. Has British Steel been nationalised? Not yet, but the legislation passed on Saturday gives the government this option. The Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds now has the power to force British Steel to buy raw materials and keep the furnaces running. What next? The government is shouldering the plant's £700,000 daily loss, but that's less than the £1 billion the Business Secretary said would cost the economy if the plant closed. The government now needs to urgently find raw materials to keep the furnaces burning and will have to decide soon whether to nationalise or find a private buyer.
Joining us this morning is steelworker Tom Smith, who was working at the furnaces on Saturday morning before attending a protest march. Good morning to you. I mean, I know steel is in your blood, isn't it? You've worked there for many years. Your dad worked there for many years before you. But just explain to people why it's so vital that this keeps running.
It's incredibly vital that the steel plant keeps running. Iron ore is the bedrock of Scunthorpe. It's built on iron. You know, it's been here for 135 years. It needs to stay here. It belongs here.
Were you part of this posse at the weekend of workers there who blocked the Chinese executives' access to the plant, stopped them coming in?
Yeah, I was aware of it. Humberside police were called, but it was dealt with minimal disruption. There was no animosity. It was just a bit of confusion by all accounts.
No, I think it's a great thing to have done, actually, because there was concern, wasn't there, that these guys, if they got into the plant, there was concern that they might sabotage it.
There was concern, but I don't think was ever in any real danger, to be honest with you. The security team handled it well enough.
You're not a politician, but you must have had a lot of conversations about this. Well, that's a compliment, actually. You must have had a lot of conversations about this. Do you think that the Chinese bought the plant with a long-term aim of closing it down so we'd have to import Chinese steel?
I don't believe they intended on closing it down. I don't believe that at all. I believe that they wanted to have the British Steel sticker on their imports. I do believe that. But I don't believe there was anything malice about their intentions at all.
What do you make of this move by the government to take control at this stage? You know, do you think that this plan will work, or do you think it just needs to be fully nationalised?
I think the initial move was a fantastic move, and I'd like to thank Sir Keir and Jonathan Reynolds for doing that. Long term, I think nationalisation is the only way forward. We've had private investors year after year, and they each seem to have taken a bit and taken it abroad. And if everyone's worried about the taxpayer burden, keep the money here with British workers here in Scunthorpe. One
of the reasons that nationalisation fell out of favour, really, politically in this country, was that it was generally regarded as being inefficient, that it was a kind of an excuse for bureaucrats to run companies, as it were, and it wasn't a particularly profitable way to go about business. Are you at all concerned about that?
No, I'm not too concerned about that, to be fair with you, Richard, no. I feel like the government now have stepped in where previous governments haven't, and what has been, has been. You know, we need to move forward now. We need to deal with what we've got and what's coming next. We can't be worried about what's behind us.
But whether we renationalise or not, and it's on the table as an option as we keep reporting, do you feel that whoever ends up running Scunthorpe, if it keeps going, we'll come to that in a second, if it keeps going, it should be British. It should never be sold to a foreign investor again?
I fully agree with that, Richard. Yes, I do. Keep it here in Britain, made by British people. I do believe that that should be the right way forward. However, I'm not naive enough to believe that it will be. Eventually, I think we will be sold, but you know, we can't be a burden on the taxpayer forever. Unless we become viable, then why not?
And just explain this process, because obviously we've got this race against time, haven't we, to get the fuel there, to keep the furnaces burning, to get this coking coal to the furnaces. There's concerns that it's just not going to get there in time. How worried are you about that? And if those furnaces don't have the fuel and they do stop burning, how bad is that situation?
I have full belief in our technical teams and our production teams and our managers. They've been held back for the past 2, maybe 3 years now, with constraints placed upon them by our previous owners. We have now the full capability, we have the backing of the government, we have materials, and we can make it happen. You know, it's not all the end.
Can you explain, well, certainly to me, and I presume a number of people watching, because we don't quite understand this, why is it so important to keep the furnaces burning? Why is it basically a one-way ticket to a complete and permanent shutdown if the furnaces stop burning? Why can't they be re-fired up?
Because of the refractory linings inside of it, Richard. So inside of each furnace there is a refractory lining, and then the stoves, which are effectively a massive heat exchanger, there's a refractory lining in there. If that's allowed to cool, it will crumble, and then it becomes a multi-million-pound operation to then get inside it, to then get the brickwork re-established with the linings, and then to get it hot again. So it's better to just keep it consistently hot, because if you let them cool and the brickwork fails, you're starting all over again.
See, thank you for explaining that.
And Tom, just put it into context for people, because, you know, at the end of the day, this is not just about saving your job, is it? There are so many other jobs that are connected because of the British Steel plant, aren't there? And also when you look at what that steel goes to build, the railways, for example, you know, this is a crucial element, isn't it, for British infrastructure?
It really is, and it's not just directly Scunthorpe, it's the wider supply chain. You know, we've got suppliers from all over this country, all over the world, and there's people all over the world that depend on us. Network Rail has a high percentage of their portfolio derived from here. You know, we make the best steel in the world, and it gets gone around the world. So it's vital, it really is vital, and we can't afford to be at the mercy of other countries and foreign trade. You know, with geopolitical instability going on all around the world and trade wars left, right and centre, we need to keep it here, we need to have that ability.
Well, I think, Tom, a lot of people would say you make a watertight case, and we keep our fingers crossed for you and for everybody up in Scunthorpe. Let's hope it ends well.
Thanks very much for joining us.
Let's come to you guys. Interestingly, Tom wasn't too keen there, was he, to point the finger against Chinese skullduggery, basically. But a lot of people are. A lot of people are saying that this is quite a dastardly plan.
It feels like sabotage.
Yeah.
And we've got huge, big rail projects coming up in this country. With new rail lines being built, we want British Steel, Scunthorpe, to provide the steel. And what I find very odd, the government called Parliament back on Saturday, a great state of emergency and crisis, and yet they don't appear to be getting on with it. There's a ship off of the British coast with the material for the coking material, and apparently they haven't paid the bill.
Well, it's a weird situation, so he can't guarantee, the Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, can't guarantee that we will actually be able to get this material in to be able to keep the furnaces going.
Why can't the government just get on with it and get it into that furnace? Tom's explained very articulately why they've got to keep burning. The material's there, get it in, and there's some administrative cock-up going on. It's crazy.
But it still seems it might be something to do with when bills are paid, and that, you know, shipment might then be redirected and sent to someone else.
This is the government. Just write a check and get that stuff in, because we cannot afford to let this steelworks collapse. And by the way, it should never, ever have got into Chinese hands in the first place.
Nels, I mean, we don't really know exactly what's going on with this, but how confident are you then that those furnaces will keep going, that the government can sort this situation out now they've taken control of British Steel?
I'd like to think, given the stakes and everything that's at play over here, I think the governments will have to be at their most competent, and just certain things just have to happen. And this is one of those things where it just has to happen. You have to get this done. I think the broader issue that we see here is that the cult of privatisation has bitten Britain once again. that the cult of Thatcherite privatisation will replace critical national infrastructure or natural monopolies into the hands of private capital has once again burnt us in a very, very bad way.
Like the water company.
Like the water companies, and so on and so forth. Now, there are some things, of course, should be in the private domain or so, airlines or so, that's totally fine. But this should never have been in private hands, certainly not in the hands of a rival producer. And I think the key thing that I took away from what Tom actually said there is something I just came back from America and other places around the world. In Britain, we don't do mass production like, say, the Chinese or perhaps the Americans do, but we do quality production. And there's something to be said about what Tom said there, that the Chinese wanted the term British steel on their imports because it was a demarcation of quality, a promise of good standards or so. And I think that's a good thing that we need to lean into as a country. But thematically, more broadly speaking, we need to really take a root and branch approach to looking at are certain things that we have privatised in the past or so, from the ghost of Thatcher in the 80s or so, till this very day, are there certain things that we have kept in the private sector that we should be looking to bring into the... bring back into the public sector as a result of...
British Steel was a complete basket case in the 1980s, by the way, and 1970s. That's why it was privatised. It was running at huge losses. It was completely incompetent and inefficient, and government should not run steel industries. The mistake with some of the privatisations is to allow major infrastructure institutions like British Steel to go into foreign hands. That's been the serious
that's what I want to talk about.
But I'm not convinced by that.
I just want to read you the opening paragraph of the lead story on the front page of the Times today. This is echoed in quite a few newspapers, but the Times puts it very succinctly. British Steel should be the canary in the coal mine that forces ministers to remove Chinese companies from critical infrastructure, they've been told. In other words, the suspicion is there that the reason that China invests in this country is not just to make money, it's to actually distort our business model so they can move in and export from China.
We got the Chinese out of Huawei 5G because we thought national security issues here. How it was ever even allowed in the first place. So I think this is right. And this government, I'm afraid, in its desperation to get growth, and God, we do need growth in the economy, has been cozying up to China too much.
But you got to remember, if you go back to the history of the plants right now, so of Scunthorpe, it wasn't just the Chinese didn't buy it directly from us. The Chinese bought it from Tata Steel.
And we went to the Chinese because there was nobody else that wanted it.
Exactly, that's totally fine. But I am not that keen on just focusing purely on the Chinese. I think what's critical national infrastructure, what are natural monopolies, should not be owned by private interest, regardless of who it is.
Though, cost, you know, who pays then? Because as a country, can we afford to then renationalise all of these things that actually do need to be in our control, because it's going to cost billions.
But why are we only having to renationalise why are we only having to step into rescue capital? Why are we only having to renationalise once they start making losses? It's unsustainable. Why is it that the actual profits are kept by them or so, but the losses are absorbed by us?
But the thing is, with Scunthorpe, the writing's been on the wall for months about these furnaces. Why have they left it so late to get involved? If they've left it far too late.
Yeah, because there have been warnings for weeks. Last September it was raised by an MP, wasn't it, about how this fuel was going to get
And if the fuel runs out, and if the furnaces go out, it's finished the plant.
Is it truly, though, just to echo something that Nigel Farage was saying yesterday on the Laura Kuenssberg programme, is this really a case of privatisation? Because, actually, is there such a thing in China as a private company? Aren't all private companies in China really a front for the Chinese government? So we actually sold it to the Chinese government.
Chinese president, he owns it.
But it does say something, once again, too, that the Chinese are operating on a very different level. Because if it is sabotage, as some people suspect it is or so, I'm not going to add credence or deny credence to that claim. Okay. But if it is or so, it shows how far ahead they're thinking in terms of actually doing things. So, because how much did it cost them to purchase? And how much could they potentially benefit or so in the long term? And I think that, again, so in terms of how they're actually playing things or so, they've played a really, really smart game. You've got to commend them to a certain degree. But overarchingly also, the key thing for us, the lesson for us is what I must keep reiterating. The cult of privatisation, we must accept that.
All right, that's where we came in.
Yep.
Should we change the record now? What do we make of the way that we treat terrorists in British prisons? We have this alleged example over the weekend of a terrorist, the brother of the Manchester Arena bomber, who helped him make the bomb. He's been jailed for life, has a record of attacking prison officers. He's been sentenced to extra years in prison because of that, for attacks committed 2 or 3 years ago, who is reportedly was allowed into the prison kitchen, heated up some form of oil, and then burst out of the kitchen, threw it all over some guards who were standing on the terrace outside, and then stabbed them with a knife that he'd made, allegedly, from a baking tray. about a 10-inch blade, and has almost killed one of the guards, apparently millimetres from death. How can this happen, that a terrorist with a record like this can be allowed into a prison kitchen?
Well, I think he because of his track record, he probably almost certainly should be in solitary confinement. But actually, I think we've got a wider problem here. There was a report only a few days ago about that particular jail, Frankland, how Islamist gangs are running prisons, running that prison from the inside. There's always been gangs in prisons.
Yeah.
That's forever.
Yeah.
But now, increasingly, they're Islamist gangs, and there's talk that people are being coerced into converting, that prison officers are terrified of the gangs because of the power they're wielding. The gangs, it seems, have taken over some of our prisons. They're not being run by the prison service or the Home Office, the gangs. And the other worrying part is all these drones are flying in drugs. When are they going to start flying in guns and knives for these Islamist gangs? We could have a real we've got a real problem.
Well, they don't need to fly them in because if these reports
can make them themselves.
They can make them themselves because of the access they've got to kitchen material.
Nels, these prison guards are lucky to have escaped with their lives, aren't they, because of what happens? And it sounds like it could only be a matter of time if changes aren't made to what's happening here. I imagine they sort of put this in place, do they, as a means of keeping the peace, because otherwise, you know, if they don't give them things to do or certain freedoms, then is there more unrest? I mean, it's just difficult to see why someone like that was given access to the kitchens in this way.
It's a very, very great point. I must say my heart goes out to the prison officers or so, and we thank them for their work and everything else and their commitment to the service. This is a very, very complex situation, because what we have here is somebody who has pretty much no life whatsoever. So he's somebody with absolutely nothing to lose whatsoever, and there's nothing more dangerous in society than somebody with nothing to lose.
He's 28, isn't he?
20, which is very young. He's going to spend the rest of his life in prison there. And so the problem we then have is that how do we, balance the idea of actually keeping these people at least motivated or productive within the system versus actually making sure we don't place people at harm? Now, there has to be some sort of risk assessment that's taken on certain people. For example, there is no way he should have been in the kitchen or near anything that could potentially cause harm to anybody whatsoever. So that was clearly a flaw in the system. And I do feel that perhaps, I don't know whether I'll go as far as what Robert Jenrick said, that we keep all prisoners away from actual kitchens, because in the past, the work in the kitchen has been a way of actually giving back.
And then when they come out of prison, it gives them vital skills, doesn't it, to potentially get employment there?
It does. In fact,
this guy's never coming out, so tough luck for him.
So the issue we now have is that there should be certain people who say you're serving life in prison or so, you shouldn't get the opportunity to be near anything of any danger whatsoever. But at the exact same time, too, we have to think of, there has to be, I wish I had the answers here, but there has to be some form of method where we can actually incentivise this person to change behaviour or so. And of course, where there are gangs...
That, though, when, as you say, he's looking at dying in prison. Yeah. So rehabilitation is kind of pointless, because he'll never come into a world that he can be rehabilitated into. He's always going to be inside four walls.
He can still be rehabilitated. Even if you're inside four walls, doesn't mean you can't change or so. If you take one of the greatest heroes of the 20th century or so, a gentleman called Malcolm X, he was rehabilitated he was nearly 100 years old from the day. He was rehabilitated in prison. So there's actually stories of redemption. People can change.
But it's hard to imagine an incident like this happening in an American
I'm sorry, he's
prison.
lost all his rights. He's in solitary confinement now for 55 years. Tough luck.
I'm saying you wouldn't see anything like this happening in an American security jail, would you?
You would.
Would you?
No, you definitely would. Prison guards get assaulted all the time in American prisons, so American prisons are very dangerous.
And I'm not sure. I'm not sure
where a story of it a couple of weeks ago.
I'm not sure where Abadi's from, but if he's from a foreign country too, deport him.
I think he's British-born.
Right, but then he's in solitary confinement.
Yeah, absolutely.
OK, shall we look at something else that's in the news today? Is the Commons Home Affairs Select Committee report into the Southport riots, and they've looked at what went on here. They talk about the fact it was fuelled by an information vacuum because key details about the killer weren't revealed, and they've said that changes have to be made because of that. It allowed disinformation to flourish about the murders of these three girls by Axel Rudakabana. And it also talks about the fact that there's no evidence of two-tier policing. I mean, it was such a shocking thing, wasn't it, to have happened in the first place, and then the riots, the you know, the destabilising situations that happened up and down the country.
The whole response didn't keep up with the fact we live in a social media age now, where people are on social media very quickly. People were speculating. There was lurid speculation about who'd done it. If you remember, people thought he would, the killer had come over on a small boat, and actually, I think he was born in Wales.
He was,
and his parents had come here.
And more than speculation, there were streams of abuse.
There were.
There were.
So they've said it's because the CPS, though, didn't allow the release of certain information because of sort of outdated processes.
That's
the
right.
suggestion,
it was far too
and that
slow,
needs to be
and there's some suspicion it went right to the top because the Prime Minister, of course, a lawyer, former head of the CPS, and we in the media we knew about who he was, but we were told not to write it. Same here with ITV, and it was a mistake by the authorities, the CPS. We should have got the information up very quickly.
You almost sound like a conspiracy theorist there. You think
it was just too slow, Richard. It was just too slow, and I could see what I mean. Look, some people went to prison over what they were putting on.
And are still in prison.
And still in prison.
Again, so there has to be a thematic change here. Once again, so there has to be a thematic change in terms of actually the process that we put into the public domain, on whether it's on all cases or particular cases. Then there has to be a change in terms of what do we put in the public domain, when is it safe to do so, who's responsible for doing that? Is it the CPS? And are we giving this stuff identity, who they might be, etc., so on and so forth? But the question I would therefore ask is, I must say my heart goes out to the parents of the 3 little girls, so first of all, but
Absolutely.
I can't imagine till this day, I can't imagine what they're going through. I hope their lives are coming back together, even if that's possible. But the question then becomes also, even if the information was in the public domain about who he was, what difference would it have made? Would there still have been riots? Would there not have been riots or so? So that's the question it then asks me, because, again, if we put his face out there in the public domain, that this was the person who we suspect of committing the actual atrocity, what difference does it potentially make? So if he was, say, I don't know, say he looked like, say, Andrew, forbid the fourth or so, would it just be, OK, well, we go about our day? But if he looked like Nels or so, it's like, let's hit the streets. No, I think that the key thing about it is that we have to recognise that in every population there are going to be people who are going to fail. There are going to be criminals. There are going to be wrongdoers inside them or so. And we can't cast aspersions over the entire population as a result of it. So I think that's the key thing here. Yep, if we want to put information into public domain, fine, we can do that. But we also have to question the response to certain things. Why we respond to certain things in some ways and with certain things in different ways. And we're seeing this too with a range of different areas in a range of different crimes within Britain also too. It seems to be less about the crime, but more about who the perpetrator is.
So I was just going to say, we're having a debate this morning about whether there should be a social media police force. Because, you know, when it comes to sort of how this information was spread, how it was all stoked up...
You mean a special unit?
Online.
There already is.
Well, they spend too much time, in my view, on social media already.
More investment in a special unit to be able to do this.
No, they spend too much time chasing crime on social media when they should be out on the streets. We want to see people out on the streets. And look, a lot of the discontent in the summer was not just over what happened in Southport. It was just discontent, problems over the impact of mass immigration in towns and social cohesion. There was a lot of that discontent was fuelled by those riots. It wasn't just because of what happened to those little girls.
Do you point the finger then at social media and what was going on there, what people were saying?
So I have a bit of expertise in this area, not because I chose to, but because young people keep contacting me all the time that they've been charged with the Malicious Communications Act, with something called the Malicious Communications Act, or the Communications Act, or something. I think I've helped about 3 or 4 people already with their charges or so, help get them exonerated, help them get their charges dropped or so, because the police are spending... It's actually dangerous to be on social media. That I don't think people realise how close you are to... You could live a very law-abiding life in this country. There's 2 things that you could potentially do that could get you in trouble really quickly. One is driving. The police can get you... That gives you a lot closer to the police. The second is going on social media. You will say the wrong thing, and overnight... You're so right. 6 months later, your house will be stormed.
Well, look at that couple over their school place.
And it's not a 2-tier basis. It's happening across the board.
You mean the couple who entered an online debate in a WhatsApp group...
And 6 police officers turn up at their home.
Parents of the school, and they were dragged in and
the police have become obsessed by social media, and they should get off the screens and on the streets.
So should people be able to say whatever they like on social media, though, when it comes to sort of pointing the fingers, causing trouble, stirring up hatred?
I don't see why we have so many people locked up for what they said over the Southport riots. I thought the prisons are full to bursting already.
Well, talking of riots on the street, we haven't seen any in Birmingham yet, but I'm rather surprised we haven't, given the state of the city. It's just appalling. And now we hear the army's been called in.
Well,
not before time.
They're just doing helping with logistical support.
And we understand, I think it's 3 officers who are helping with logistical support.
Yeah,
so it's support. So before people think that the army will be swarming Birmingham picking up bin bags...
Well, I think people in Birmingham would probably quite like the idea that the army were...
Maybe that will be the next step.
Because the Labour council's lost control of this. This is an international embarrassment, and it's a health hazard. These rats are as big as cats.
Oh, and they were saying the trouble is when they go in and pick up the... Oh, apparently we're not sure they're that big as cats.
Well,
don't be scaremongering about the rat sizes, Andrew. But what I would say is, as soon as that rubbish goes, the rats are all going to disperse somewhere unless they sort that out.
It's a health hazard.
That was going to be my challenge, because I've heard this term so often, the rats the size of cats. Also, and
You have small cats?
But show me a rat the size of it. I would love to see it.
Well,
I've seen big rats, about this big, without its tail. I mean, that's pretty big, isn't it?
That's pretty big. It's quite
the
scary.
piles of rubbish are moving because the rats are in the rubbish.
Exactly.
It's grotesque.
Should we finish on a light note?
The sooner
with a
it's
joke?
cleaned up, the better.
Well, I mentioned conspiracy theories earlier. I had a great conspiracy theory joke at the weekend. I thought I'd pass it on. Basically, a conspiracy theorist dies and goes to heaven, and God is waiting for him when he gets there. And the conspiracy theorist says, "You're God?" He says, "I am." He said, "Can I ask you a question?" He says, "Certainly." He said, "Who assassinated JFK?" And God says, "It was Lee Harvey Oswald, and he was acting alone." And the conspiracy theorist says, "Ha! This thing goes a lot higher than I thought." I thought it was the best conspiracy joke.
Very good.
Very
like
good,
that.
Actually. There are so many ways, aren't there, of being scammed online. It's just getting worse. And ticket fraud has surged by 47% in the last 12 months, with Action Fraud reporting losses of nearly £10 million to scammers in 2024.
Well, as the summer approaches, police are warning people to be extra vigilant against online scams. Amanda Beasley lost £400 trying to get Taylor Swift tickets for her daughter Lilly's birthday. They both join us now, alongside cybersecurity expert Jake Moore, who has advice to make sure it doesn't happen to you. Good morning to all of you. Thanks for coming in to talk about this. So, Amanda, you were obviously in a situation where you desperately wanted to sort tickets. We all know those Taylor Swift tickets were like gold dust.
They were,
weren't they? So what happened? You spotted an opportunity and went for it.
It was a friend of a friend on Facebook. We checked out the profile. It wasn't a new profile. It's a profile that had been on Facebook for years. So we checked it out. My eldest children checked it out. It looked legitimate. So they were selling the tickets for the price that they paid them for, which I thought maybe was a little bit suspect. However, they said that they just was going to sell the tickets at cost because their daughter couldn't go due to illness.
Oh, right. So it wasn't like a kind of like a mini company or a dealer of some kind. These were purporting to be private individuals who, like you, had bought tickets for their kid. Then the kid gets ill or has to go away, who can't go, so they just sell them on.
Yeah.
So that's pretty plausible, isn't it?
Really? I mean, at the beginning we thought, you know, that there's always an idea that it could possibly be a scam, but we was just so hopeful because we tried all other ways of getting the Taylor Swift tickets.
Hope. Optimism.
Yeah, so we
wishful
was
thinking.
a bit blindsided by the hope, I think,
So when did you realise, then, that all was not as it seemed?
Well, we had to... My eldest son had a PayPal account. They said that we needed to set up a PayPal account and transfer it to their account, and then the ticket would be then transferred into our name. However, when we transferred the money into the PayPal account, the money was held and nobody knew why. PayPal couldn't tell us why. So I was asking the person that I was speaking to, why has it been held? They were saying they didn't know why. So at that point, I thought, right, something's going on now.
Right.
So you basically called them and called them and called them and called them.
Yeah.
And every time you got through, they rang off on you.
Well, yeah, because I said, if this is legitimate, then let's have a Facebook Messenger face-to-face conversation.
Sort this out, yeah.
Yeah, so
what happened in the end?
In the end, because I just kept calling them to annoy them, they answered, they said, you've lost your money, you've been scammed, laughed, put the phone down.
And you said it was an American accent?
American-African accent, yeah.
Oh, but you must have been absolutely gutted then when you realised that.
Yeah, well, I think by this point we knew, but I was so upset because it was for Lily's 21st. We tried all other ways for getting the tickets, and it would have been the best present I could have ever got her whole life.
And Lily, how did you feel? Because I know you were a massive Taylor Swift fan, weren't you? These tickets were going to be for your birthday.
It was absolutely gutting, really.
Because you thought you'd got them.
Absolutely. So it was the high of being like, oh, I'm going to see Taylor Swift, and then the low of, I'm not going to see Taylor Swift, and my mum's also been scammed out of £400.
And
so
£400 is, you know, a lot of money,
And they're laughing at her as well. I mean, just to rub salt in the wound.
Yeah.
But you did get the money back.
Yeah, because I was a little bit proactive. I thought, I'm not going to have this. So I was, like, calling and emailing local radio stations. And fortunately, my local BBC Radio WM, they were running features on the Taylor Swift scams, and they got me in touch with PayPal Direct. So I got to speak to the powers that be, and then we got our money back.
They sorted it out. Well, that is good. Well, let's come over to Jake now. Jake Moore, cybersecurity expert. I mean, I guess you were sort of hearing alarm bells with the story of that as to kind of things that went wrong there. Give people some top tips for how to stop this happening to them.
Yeah, so these scammers are working in huge operational gangs, and they know exactly what they're doing. They're really targeting people who are emotionally invested in wanting those tickets.
That wishful thinking syndrome that we just picked up
So
on.
it's really important to stick to the official sites. So the sites that are advertised on the artist's website or on the box office from the venue that you're actually going to, and really try and stick to those. And if you have to pay online, so yeah, use PayPal, or if it's over £100, use a credit card to get that extra protection.
Hang on, why does PayPal give you protection?
Well, if you go with saying that it's for goods and services, then they hold the money, and if you could then complain, then, like in Amanda's case, you may then be able to get the money back.
And the credit card just gives you automatic coverage, anyway.
Yeah, over £100, it will also offer you that protection. So it's really good, rather than sending via a bank transfer.
Right. Are you saying then, listening to that story, that she made the mistake right at the start by going to that person, thinking that they were for real, that she should never have even started the process? It wasn't that she made mistakes along the way. She should never even have gone there in the first place.
Well, we never like to blame any victim, because I know what it's like. You're desperate for those tickets, and you might see an advert or a group on Facebook, for example, and it's saying a legitimate reason for why they might have those tickets on offer. You did the right checks. I always say to people, make sure you do all that research. But these gangs, they're stealing Facebook accounts, so they have been around for years. So when you do your research, it seems plausible, and so they come up with an excuse for why they can't go, and you want to then transfer the money. So it's really important to do extra research. But if you can get someone else to look at it first, before you give them that money, they might be able to spot something because they're not emotionally invested as you are.
I mean, this is only getting worse, isn't it? It's surged by 47% in the last year. You know, is enough being done? Is this only going to get worse and worse and worse for people and lose more money?
So the companies are doing all they can. So they're using technology to try and help. So, for example, they're using these things called dynamic barcodes. So these codes that constantly move. So they can't then send you a screenshot of a barcode, because then it just simply changes all the time. You might see them on train tickets, for example. When you see the barcode, another red line just moves across, so they don't accept that screenshot. Because if someone is to send you a screenshot that is actually a real ticket, they might also be sending that to multiple people. So really the first person gets in, then everyone else is denied entry.
So the moral of the story seems to be, and it's all with hindsight, because I would have fallen for it like you did, with no question at all. I would have done those checks and I would have believed them.
Yeah.
But the moral is that if you can't get the ticket that you desperately want on a legitimate site that you know is an authentic site, you've just got to accept you're not going to the party.
Yeah,
it's as
that's
simple as
it,
that.
yeah.
And, you know, an offer that seems too good to be true is
It
probably
normally is.
too good to be
Yeah.
true. Yeah.
And so you still haven't got to see Taylor Swift then?
No, I haven't.
Oh, well, hopefully another time soon in that case. Fingers crossed. Thanks so much for coming in to tell your story this morning. It will have helped others. Thank you.
Well, let's hear from PayPal. We spoke to them and they told us we can't comment on individual cases, but we do have a robust process in place to help protect customers. It's called buyer protection, and that covers purchases that don't arrive or don't match the seller's description. So you do have recourse through PayPal. Also, Facebook's owner Meta told us we don't allow fraudulent activity and work closely with law enforcement to support investigations and to keep scammers off our platforms. We continue to work closely with Stop Scams UK to help victims and remove scams at source. What about prosecutions? Did any of these characters ever get caught and done?
Very rarely. I've worked in the police force and they've been spending lots of time and effort into these extra resources into cybercrime units. Unfortunately, these gangs, they know exactly how to get away with it.
Yeah. So it's knife-edge time, isn't it? Government officials and British Steel staff in a desperate race against time to save Scunthorpe steel plant from closure. It still does not have the raw materials to keep those 2 blast furnaces burning.
Well, Treasury Minister James Murray joins us now from Westminster. Good morning to you.
Morning.
The Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, has talked about this. He says that there's no guarantee that this fuel will arrive in time to keep the furnaces burning. So why not a guarantee then? Can you bring us up to date on that? How are we looking with getting that coking coal to the furnaces in time to make sure that they can keep burning?
Yes, no, thank you. Well, what I can explain is that we've got officials who are on site now as we speak, doing everything they can to get those raw materials into the blast furnaces to keep them going. You know, we've had officials involved on site since the legislation was passed in the House of Parliament on Saturday. And the only reason we're in this situation now, where the Business Secretary is able to get officials on site doing everything they can to get the raw materials to keep the blast furnaces going, is because we took that action. And if we hadn't taken that action at the weekend, we'd now be having a very different conversation where we'd be talking about why these blast furnaces closed already. Okay. So we're doing everything we can to keep them going. So
what do you think the chances are then that materials will get there in time to keep those furnaces going? Because obviously, you know, as we know and as we've been told by steel workers as well, that once they go out, that's it, isn't it?
Well, you're right that once they go out, it's much harder to restart them, and that's why it was such a priority for us to act quickly over the weekend, passing that legislation on Saturday, because what became apparent in the days running up to Saturday was that Jingye, the company who owns the plant, was behaving irresponsibly, and they were accelerating their plans to close the blast furnaces. So we had to act very quickly. That's why we went into Parliament on Saturday to pass that legislation, and why we're now able to act to secure the future of steelmaking in the UK.
You say act very quickly, but actually there are accusations that you've acted too late on this. There have been warnings for weeks, haven't there, about the fuel running out and the company's viability. Back in September, questions were raised by the Conservative MP Martin Vickers about coal imports. You've left it to the last minute, haven't you, to intervene on this? I mean, the clock is literally counting down.
Well, no, we've been working on this since the general election, working with Jingye, with the company involved. We made a very generous offer to them to keep the production going at Scunthorpe. What became apparent in the last few days, what's changed, is it's become clear that they've accelerated their plans to close the blast furnaces, and that's what became so urgent, because, as you rightly said, once the blast furnaces turned off, it's much harder to turn them back on. And we are absolutely serious about having a future for steelmaking here in the UK. We need that future for steelmaking for our national security, and also to support all of our plan for change in terms of building 1.5 million new homes, all the infrastructure we want to build, hospitals, railways, all of the stuff we want to do. We need to have steel-making capacity in the UK to support that to happen. So that's why we decided to act quickly over the weekend, as I say, having that legislation in Parliament on Saturday. But that then gives us the opportunity to secure the long-term future in a sustainable way.
Well, it was an opportunity, and the question is, has it come in time, as Charlotte's asking there? Look, I've listened really carefully to everything you've said. I've also been reading the transcripts of interviews you've given to other media outlets earlier this morning, and taking into account them and other comments made by government spokesmen at the weekend, it strikes me that you're attempting to manage expectations here. You can't guarantee that the raw materials are going to arrive in time. You're unable to guarantee that. You can't say that to me now. Therefore, you're managing expectations and you're preparing us for failure. There's obviously a possibility, isn't there, that this stuff won't get there in time and those furnaces will go cold. Are you prepared to admit that?
So look, I realise what I'm going to say is going to be frustrating for you and possibly for some of your viewers, but there are commercial processes underway, and I don't want to say anything on your TV programme that undermines those commercial processes, OK? So those commercial processes are happening as we speak. I'm confident that all action is being taken to get those raw materials in place, but I don't want to undermine those processes that are underway.
In that case, I wouldn't dream of asking you to talk about those commercial processes, so let's push that off the table. It still leaves the question open, though, doesn't it? Whatever those processes may or may not be, you can't guarantee that they're going to work.
Well, as I say, I don't want to comment on those commercial processes because I don't want to undermine them. But the commercial processes are what's happening at the moment as part of the efforts to get the raw materials into the blast furnaces. You know, the reason why we have officials directed by the Secretary of State on site is because of what we did over the weekend. You know, we'd be having a very different conversation if we hadn't have taken those powers on Saturday. We'd be talking about why these blast furnaces closed. And the fact that we now have the officials on site trying to get the raw materials in there means that we can have a conversation instead about keeping them going and then the long-term future of steelmaking in the UK.
Well, on the principle of hoping for the best but preparing for the worst, if the furnaces do go cold, and they can't be started up again without massive investment on relining them, as we've heard this morning, would the government be prepared to commit to doing that? You say that it's vital that we keep our steel industry, our virgin steel industry, going in this country. If these raw materials arrive in Scunthorpe too late, and you haven't been able to rule that out, and I understand why, but you haven't been able to rule it out, would the government commit to spending many, many more millions on relining the furnaces and starting them up again?
Well, all our efforts at the moment are on keeping them going. But let me talk directly about costs, because you rightly raised the question around costs, and it's ones that I'm sure a lot of your viewers will be interested in. Now, we know that Jingye has been losing around £233 million a year. That's what their annual accounts show. So we know that, you know, as the business secretary said over the weekend, we expect there to be a loss through our involvement. But the alternative, if we had let the blast furnaces close, if Jingye acting irresponsibly had led to the blast furnaces closing, that would have cost the taxpayer well over £1 billion in terms of intervening with land remediation, dealing with the issues of the workforce, and so on. So, you know, getting involved does have implications in terms of finances, but we think it's the best use of public money rather than having risked the blast furnaces closing with far greater cost and far greater long-term impact on steel making in the UK.
But isn't the case that, you know, we're unlikely to find a private partner to then team up with this because of the losses that you've mentioned that Jingye have already incurred? It's a loss-making plant, isn't it? Therefore, nationalisation seems inevitable. Taxpayers want to know what the financial implication of that is for them, because it's set to be billions, isn't it? Can we actually afford to do this? If we're looking at a country where we're cash-strapped with the NHS, we're cash-strapped with defence, people are finding it hard to pay for their energy bills. This country's in dire straits at the moment. Can we afford the billions needed?
So you're right to say that nationalisation is a likely outcome. The Business Secretary was clear about that over the weekend. It's also important to emphasise, though, that in the long term, we want to find a private sector partner who can co-invest with us and make sure we have a sustainable long-term future for steelmaking.
Sorry to interrupt, but looking at the figures, who is going to want to do that, though? You know, when it came to sort of looking for a partner before, Jingye was the only company who wanted to do it, and it's unlikely, looking at the figures and the losses that they've incurred, that anyone else would find it remotely interesting to invest in it.
Well, look, you know, today, right now, it is not a proposition that a private sector partner would want to invest in as we speak. As I say, the priority today is to keep the blast furnaces going. But what we need to do is find that long-term future. And you asked an important question a second ago about the money that's going in, about the government investment that is going in to keep the blast furnaces going. Now, this is all part of £2.5 billion, which we allocated at the last budget to steel, to protecting the future of steel in the UK. So that's money that's already been allocated. It's not drawing on other resources. It's identified to support steel in the UK. And that's why we think this is a good use of those resources to keep the blast furnaces going.
Minister, we're almost out of time, but I do want to ask you one more question. I'm sure you maybe haven't had time to look at the front page of the Times newspaper this morning. I'd like to quote you the opening paragraph of their lead story. British steel should be the canary in the coal mine that forces ministers to remove Chinese companies from critical British infrastructure. Is that the case? I mean, a lot of people are pointing the finger at the Chinese government and are saying that they actually invested in this project in Scunthorpe in order eventually to close it down, so we'd have to import Chinese steel. If that's the case, and there's a lot of suspicion that that is the case, then it clearly has implications for other Chinese companies, well, we say companies, but they're really fronts for the Chinese government, investment and involvement here in Britain. Is it time to have a good, long look at that?
Well, look, there's no doubt that Jingye acted irresponsibly, but I don't think it's right to then say we can cast judgment on all Chinese companies. And actually, what we need to do is make sure that we're encouraging investment from around the world. We believe in free trade. We want to have that investment from around the world. But where there is foreign investment or foreign involvement in critical infrastructure, whatever country that comes from, there should be a high level of scrutiny. And I think more widely, our relationship with China should be, open-eyed, pragmatic. We realise that China is our fourth biggest trading partner. There are 450,000 jobs in the UK that depend on exports to China. We need to have that balanced relationship where in some areas we work together, in other areas we compete, and in further areas we challenge them. But I think there's that balanced relationship of encouraging investment, but when it's national infrastructure, critical infrastructure, we need a high level of scrutiny, whatever country that money is coming from.
James Murray, Treasury Minister, thanks for your time this morning.
We're joined by GB News presenter from the Mail's Andrew Pearce and the writer and broadcaster Nels Abbey. Well, you were listening to the interview just then with James Murray, the government spokesman of the day, the Treasury Minister. What do you reckon?
Didn't inspire much confidence and faith, did it, that the British steel industry is going to be saved?
No.
They've had weeks and months to get this organised, and there's apparently a great ship in Ingham Harbour with 55,000 tonnes of coke from Japan. They can't release it. It's been there since Thursday because nobody's paid for it.
Well, there's something on it. We're not quite
Some
sure of the
commercial
details of
issue that he wouldn't get
material
into.
is on it. But yes, so he kept saying there are limits on what he could say because it's commercial
It'd be unforgivable if this plant
Did
closes.
you hear the authentic... See, I did. I heard the authentic sound of a politician covering their backside.
Yeah, I agree.
Basically, so he can turn around and say in a couple of days, I didn't guarantee it. I'm sorry that they've gone cold, but I did make it clear that we weren't 100%.
I mean, they recall Parliament unusually on a Saturday, so a sense of great drama and emergency, and they still haven't guaranteed that this plant's going to stay open.
And they can't guarantee it this morning.
Did
You would have thought overnight.
Something
because
might
this
check.
question was extant all through the day yesterday. You think by this morning they would have got it sorted.
You would have thought so too. The smart thing to do in a situation is to under-promise and over-deliver. And that is my interpretation.
So that's what they're gearing up for,
That is what I hope they're doing for. Because, look, it is completely unthinkable that this does not... that they don't deliver on this.
Doesn't work.
Yeah.
So they have to do that. And I think what they're doing now is they're setting themselves up to look like heroes, essentially. And I think...
Riding it at the last moment.
That's my hope. Be our saviors, that would be good.
Total incompetence. This should have been sorted out months ago. And part of the problem for British Steel is the enormous costs of British energy. Our energy is so expensive here, 50% more expensive than Germany and France, and 150% more expensive in America. That is a big problem because of the dash to net zero by this government.
Net zero, yes. Privatisation also at the exact same time to placing your critical national infrastructure, your natural monopolies into the hands of private capital. So they're going to want to make money. They want something back for it. There's no such thing as a free lunch, and there's no such thing as cheap electricity when it's in the private sector. So and they're not operating in national interest. They are operating in the interest of the bottom line. So the key thing that we're having to deal with over here right now is that how do we make sure that we just look across the board, that we don't find ourselves in this sort of trouble again. I don't think this is a China state issue owning British infrastructure. I think that we just need to look a lot more sensibly, a lot more broadly. What have we done to us, to our country, and what are we doing? And we can't continue this.
He sort of skirted that question, the question about the Chinese government, didn't he? He didn't really answer. He said, well, we have to look carefully at all investors.
Balanced relationships.
Balanced relationship, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. Whereas, what is being said now across the land is, are we wise to let the Chinese government and their front companies invest in critical, we're not talking about biscuit factories, we're talking about critical British infrastructure. Are we not asking for trouble? Because China is not a friend.
No, they're not, and they're almost a rogue state. Look what they're doing to they're murdering people, genocide with the Uyghur Muslims. And it's a bad country, and they're only interested in us. They're spying on us. We took them out of the 5G Huawei because we didn't want them involved in our crucial IT technology and telecom technology. They should never have been allowed to buy British Steel, and that happened on Boris Johnson's watch, and it was a terrible mistake.
I think it's a mistake also to look at China as not a friend or potentially a friend, or any state of that too. We shouldn't be looking at who's our friend, who's not our friend. We should be looking at what are our interests or so, and how are they best championed by who or so. Because if you look, we thought America was our best friend or so, special relationship, which sounds like a guy who's deep in the friend zone or so, doesn't know that he's there. Mm-hmm. But the key thing about it is that we need to think of things right now in terms of our interest. Stop thinking about who's our friend, who's not our friend. What is our interest? And we have to start looking at things across the board, thematically. Should water be in private hands? Should electricity? Should gas? Should steel also be in private hands?
How much money does it take to unpick all of that, though,
Trillions.
at this stage, when we're in a situation where they are in private hands?
Trillions.
Yeah, well... It's going to cost.
And we're in debt
there's different ways of actually viewing it also too. Yes, it's how much money will it potentially cost, but at the exact same time also the opportunity. I don't want to use that term because it's horrible. The opportunity cost also, the cost of actually not doing so, of not actually doing this is much higher. Because again, it's not just the cost of actually, in terms of pounds and pence that we're measuring what's going on right now with the Chinese, with Jingye also, and Scunthorpe. But we're looking at economic security and national security. We're looking at where do we find the steel
I'm afraid I don't have your faith in this British state running major organisations and consortiums. I have no faith whatsoever they do it any better. In fact, much worse.
That is a point.
Briefly, you talk about our friends maybe not being America anymore, as much as they used to be. Where are we with Trump now? I mean, at the weekend, there was another sort of U-turn when he said, well, actually, when I talked about the tariff on Chinese goods, I wasn't talking about computers and telephones and Wi-Fi software.
He had a complaint from Apple, hasn't he?
So that's another U-turn. How much credibility does he have left?
None. I just got back from Miami and Dallas, and I must say the American people are some of the most lovely people in the world. So I have American family. I genuinely love America and the American state. Well, the American state also and everything else. I love how their country works. So Dallas is a beautiful place, and Miami I go there once a year. Just came back.
Okay,
but the key thing about it, right, is that when I was walking through the actual immigration, it's the first time in my life or so where my heart where I was suffering from palpitations. So I thought to myself, am I on the verge of being deported for something I may have said on Twitter, or so something, or some criticism I may have actually had, or so? And you would have thought this wouldn't be happening in a democracy. But overarching, more broadly speaking, what you say about the economy right now, there's actions that have been taken by the Trump government that reeks of corruption that we would normally associate with the most third world developing nations. Blatant corruption or so, where the president is issuing wink nods, now is a good time for you to buy.